Okay, let me sort of start with a pre-class announcement. I've got a new baby webcam, which works fairly well in most of the classrooms. So if you want, we can start having class over in the ed building where the designated classroom is. Was it at 103, I think. So we can do that. So far, no one had said that they really wanted to, so I'm just doing it. The system is more stable and more robust if I use my office. So, all things being equal, it'd be easier to do this way. But if you want to be in class, if you want to sit in the classroom, we do have our classroom available, and now I've got a system so we could do that. So if anyone wants to have a regular sit-down class session in the classroom at our regular time, let me know, and I'll start moving this class over to the classroom in the building next door where we're supposed to be. Otherwise, I'll keep it here because I have access to my tea, so it makes me a happy camper. So let me know. It's not a problem, and now that I've got a system that I'm pretty sure works most of the time, I think. So that was sort of like a pre-announcement. So if you really want to be back in class, then that's now available, and I think I can make it work. I mean, the problem I was having before is I could do that, but I couldn't save it. So I couldn't make a Panopto video for folks to access later. So now I've got that. I think I've got that sorted out. I don't know, we'll see. This is all sort of a work in progress. I'm used to working in a corporate environment where the stuff works all the time, so it's always sort of hard to deal with the sort of patchwork qualities. Anyways. Actually, the first thing I wanted to go over that's actually tied to class, I guess are there any questions or anything? I don't see anyone jumping up and down, so I'll assume not. I wanted to go over something that I actually probably should have mentioned last time, and I was thinking so much about that break of bulk thing that I wanted to present that visually. I forgot this other part. So let me sort of back up a little bit. And this has to do with sort of the impacts of just-in-time delivery. I had the advantage or disadvantage when I was in your position as an undergraduate. I was a manager of a Kmart store, which is sort of like the precursor to Walmart. And trust me, as an undergraduate, that's an interesting experience. But one of the side effects of that is I actually ended up at the cusp of when this all changed and just-in-time delivery showed up, because that's what killed Kmart was just-in-time. Kmart was basically a cheap store, so it was like Walmart, but it was based in the generation before. You guys are more familiar. The best example I can think of right now that's highly visible would be Macy's. So the way that things used to be until basically 25, 30 years ago was that if Madison or someone is the manager of a department or a store or something like that, we'll say she's head of women's clothing at Macy's. What you do is every week you'd put in orders. They'd then either telex in the orders or later they'd email in the orders, and you'd say what you wanted. Now, what would happen is every week or so there'd be the containers coming in from Matson, from the mainland or wherever, and she'd get a pile of stuff that would show up at the warehouse for her department at her store. So if she's women's wear at Macy's, all of a sudden a truck would show up and it'd be a whole pile of boxes for her and her staff to sort out and figure out where they're going to put them in the store. And what she'd find out almost invariably would be is a large number of the boxes that showed up weren't the stuff that she ordered, but were other stuff that had been ordered by Macy's. In other words, the company Macy's would have ordered something, and that's usually done a year in advance. One of my ex-in-laws, she was actually the main buyer for Walmart for Christmas stuff. And I'm pretty sure she's retired now, but if she was working at Walmart now in 2020, the stuff that you'd see at Walmart for Christmas in 2020 was actually purchased in 2018. And then it's made in 2019 to be sold in 2020. So all the stuff is done way in advance. So if Madison's in charge of the women's wear at Macy's, she's got to find a bunch of boxes that are showed up in the classic system that would be in a warehouse somewhere. They'd be shipped to Hawaii, put in the Macy's warehouse, which I think is in Evelay somewhere, and then it would be sent to her store, and she'd have to figure out what to do with it. Now the problem you get to, and you can actually see this at Macy's. In fact, I'm sure if Macy's, if we weren't in the middle of COVID, we'd see this all over the place. And you can see the old style stores, because right now the old style stores that have a bunch of winter wear in them. And the reason for that would be that Macy's buys stuff as an entity. And because on the most of the mainland, there's winter, by, in fact, it's way too late, but by July, you'd already be selling winter coats and winter stuff in the stores for people to have and wear them as the weather got colder. And so that's done at the corporate level. So if she's, if she's the Kahala store for Macy's, if she's the women's wear at Kahala, she suddenly finds herself with like 6 or 8 boxes full of these heavy, heavy coats that she has no idea, she can't even give those away to folks, but she's stuck with them. And she has to figure out how to sell them because the company that makes things makes X amount of coats for Macy's, and Macy's orders X amount of coats. And if you work in a particular store, it's your job to figure out how to sell those coats. It doesn't make any bit of difference whether it makes any sense or not. You just have to do it. That's the old style system. We call this production-driven economies and production-driven sales. So the system that existed prior to basically, we'll just say arbitrarily, year 2000, what you have is companies that make things. So figure factories are, industrial revolution factories are making stuff, and they make X amount of things, and each company buys whatever number of those things, and they go to all the different places. So, whatever factory makes coats, Macy's buys 80,000 coats, and each store gets, 400 coats or something like that. No one's interested in what Madison has to say about the fact that she can't even give away coats in Kahala Mall in October. She had given away as freebies at the front door, and people probably go, no thanks. So they don't care. The production company, the production is driven by the factory. The factory makes X amount of things. Macy's buys X amount of things. So Madison is stuck trying to sell X amount of things. This was the period until the year 2000. This is why every company had huge warehouses. And you had warehouses where you stashed all the stuff that came in. At that point, then you had to figure out how to sell the damn things. And this is the world that I grew up in retail, which is where you'd have to sell candy. For example, this Halloween, you'd be selling candy that actually showed up in early November last year, which is why you probably don't want to buy candy from retail stores. And that's because you just have it sitting around in boxes because you can't sell it after Halloween. So you're stuck with it basically waiting for another 11 months till Halloween shows back up again, at which point you can then sell it again. And that's because the factory that makes the candy makes X amount of it, and every store gets X amount of it, and then you've got to figure out what to do with it. And it's your job, if you're retail, to sell the stuff. So it's basically your production is driven by the places that make things. Actually, a more recent example was when I bought my Abarth, my little Fiat. The salesman was complaining to me that the cutter, who was the Fiat, dealer here, got sent 8 dark blue Fiats. And he said, we can never sell dark blue Fiats. People don't buy dark blue colored cars here in Hawaii, especially Fiats. But they were sent their quota of them because the Fiat factory made X amount of Fiats, and every retailer, every dealer in the United States gets X amount of dark blue Fiats because that's just the way it happens. So no one asked the retailer or the consumer, what do you want to buy? It's just these literally show up on the lot, and then it's the job of the company, i.e. the dealer, to figure out how to sell the stupid things. At the same time, he was complaining if he had black ones, he could have sold twice as many. Other colors, he could sell them as fast as they got off the boat. Blue ones, he couldn't even give them away. That's the old idea of production driven. The factory that makes Fiats decides that we're going to make 10,000 dark blue ones because it's Thursday, and they make them, and then it's everyone's job to figure out how to sell the damn things. That's the old way of doing things, where things were driven by the production. In other words, if you want to, the factory assembly line made stuff, and then it was everyone else's job to figure out how to basically distribute or get rid of it, sell it. With the development of just-in-time delivery, and Walmart did this very intentionally, and this is why they wiped out a lot of their competition, is what they told the factories is they said, once they got big enough, they said, if you want to sell something in Walmart, you don't send us boxes of stuff because you made them. What we'll do is we'll tell you, we want you to make, 20 boxes of Halloween candy to send to the Walmart store in Keomoku Street on the 5th of October. And the guys making the candy are going to say, well, what about the week before? And Walmart's going to say, well, I don't care. We don't need the week before. The week after, we don't need the week after. So what Walmart did is they turned the whole thing on its head. What Walmart said is the places that are selling things tell the factory how much they want and when they want it and where they want it. Whereas before, the factory made the stuff and it was the job of the retailers and everyone else to sell the stuff. So they turned the whole thing on its head. And a really good example of this, which is very successful, is BMW. If you buy a Mini Cooper, which is what I had before the Fiat, if you buy a Mini Cooper and you go to BMW, they actually, you very rarely buy the car that's in a dealership. What you do is you go to their website and you actually build the car you want. You say what color you want, how many stripes you want on it, everything else you want about the car, you basically tell them. And what they do is they send you back an email and they say that your car's going to end up in Hawaii on November 10th. So they basically build that car at the factory based on what you want to have. And now on one hand, as a consumer, that's great because it means you get exactly what you're looking for. On the other hand, if you're the factory, how does that jam up your production if you're the guys that make Mini Coopers? Why does it make life hard for you? Or let's put it this way, why does it make it hard for the folks that work on the assembly line? What are they not going to know anymore? I'll give you a hint. Fiat and Chrysler don't do this. Fiat and Chrysler do it the old way. You just literally make these cars. They come down a conveyor belt. You do them the way you're going to do them. You've decided what's going to work, and you just basically make these things. And every week, if you guys all work for Fiat Chrysler, you go to the factory and you got to make 20 cars this week, or whatever the number is. And it's all nice and clean and straightforward, and you know because that's how many cars you make. It ain't your problem whether someone has trouble selling them. Now, if you think about the BMW Mini Cooper factory, if you guys work for that factory, what don't you know when you go to work on Monday every week?
How much cars you need to build.
Exactly. Or what colors you're going to have, or what type of interiors they're going to want. You don't know nothing. It's going to show up on the chart and it's going to show up in your computers. And okay, we need to make 10 red ones today, but we're not going to have to make any red ones till December. And we might need no dark blue ones. And we might need 100 dark blue ones. You just don't know. So if you think about it, that means that your assembly line doesn't look like the stereotype of an assembly line, which is just things moving smoothly from one end to another. Now it's going to go like this. It's going to jerk, stop, jerk, stop. Maybe they're going to lay you off for 2 days this week because no one wants Mini Coopers this week. And all of a sudden next week, they're going to want you to work double shifts because now a bunch of people want Mini Coopers. So as before, you just basically came to work and almost like a robot, just sort of like did your thing. In a just-in-time delivery system, now the people that are selling the stuff or distributing it or whatever are basically telling the folks that make it, this is what we need and this is when we need it. So it turned this whole process completely on its head. It put the factories at the tail end of the system, whereas before they'd been the driving force in the system. Now, one of the side effects is that meant that it was very difficult to do a factory, and it is very difficult to do factories nowadays because you literally do not know from one day or 1 week to the next what you're going to be making or how much you're going to be making or when. You can predict it, based on last year, but if you think about it, in a COVID year in the middle of October, how the hell, if you make candy, how the hell are you going to figure out how much candy you need to sell? Stores probably don't even have an idea how much. I can guarantee Walmart has no idea how much Halloween candy they need because they're not even sure what people are going to do for Halloween. Are they going to send the kids out? Are they just going to pig out at home? What are they going to do? Are they just not going to buy any at all because they don't have any money because everyone's out of work? So if you're the candy factory, you're just freaking out. You literally just watch your computer hoping the orders will show up so you can basically turn the assembly line, call people up literally and say, hey, can you get your butt down to the factory an hour because we now got an order? Okay, whereas before you just would make this stuff and you'd work, 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, and you just make candy, and then it was someone else's problem to figure out what to do with it. You just produced it. That's the 21st century world. Now, in that context, why are robot assembly lines so attractive then? Versus the old system, which is people.
Less hands to do the same.
Yeah. If Peyton's in charge of the factory and it's a robotized system, he just basically goes there, codes, and the computer turns it on. And they make as many as they got to make. He turns it off. He doesn't have to lay people off. He doesn't have to hire people. He doesn't have to tell anyone, oh, come in on Friday. So one of the huge pushes for sort of robotized automation in production is literally the fact that once you have just-in-time delivery, which is based entirely on consumer preferences and all sorts of things that can literally change, in a moment. If you think about, not so much this year, but if you think about last year, the amount of trends that would occur because all of a sudden a popular movie came out and all of a sudden everyone needed to have something from the movie or something that looked like something that was worn in the movie. So all of a sudden you have to have this massive increase of something, and maybe some other movie flops, and all of a sudden you got stuff that you don't need. You guys still see that. That's what you see for sale in places like Ross's. It's the stuff that didn't sell because someone made a bad guess somewhere along the line. And it's not by accident that a lot of stuff at Macy's ends up at Ross's. And Nordstrom's is one of the other places that does it old style. They make stuff in factories in bulk, and then it's just sent out to the stores and have to figure out what to do with it. And that's why you end up with the other version of Nordstrom's. I can never remember what it's called, the one down there in Ward Avenue. Okay, the sort of cheap discount branch of Nordstrom's. That's all the stuff they can't sell in the regular stores because they're still doing it the old way, where you literally make boxes of stuff and then just send the stuff out to every place, and they have to figure out what to do with it. The newer version is the Walmart version, which is basically that stuff shows up in the store. That's exactly what you know you're going to sell, which means the whole mess of things. One is you don't have to have a warehouse anymore. Walmart only has one small warehouse here. You don't need to have the folks that work in a warehouse, which get paid a lot of money. You don't need to have that type of distribution system. And someone like Madison isn't having nightmares suddenly visualizing 20 boxes of heavy coats showing up in the middle of October, in Honolulu. So it makes life a lot easier for all those folks. And it's a lot cheaper and more cost efficient for Walmart. But it also just makes life a nightmare if you're at the production end of things, because all of a sudden before you had predictability, now you've got no predictability. And Amazon, of course, makes this even worse because Amazon's the ultimate form of online delivery. Okay? Because basically it's online, and theoretically, if you're on the mainland where the Prime is 48 hours, it's on time. In fact, if you're familiar with what Amazon's up to now, you guys can now order groceries at Amazon and have them delivered in 2 hours in Seattle and San Francisco. So you can actually have dinners made for you on Amazon and delivered by, if you order at 6 by 8 p.m., you'll have your dinner. So that's the ultimate version of this just-in-time delivery. If you're a restaurant or a kitchen, now it's like every day is on one hand you're making money, but it's sort of a nightmare compared to the way it used to be in the past. So just-in-time delivery has a huge amount of impacts, and we'll soon get into this whole idea of sort of production cycles in terms of the way it's changed. It's only changed in the last 20 years. And folks that get involved in things like management or business, if you get involved in those areas, this is something you really have to deal with that, to be honest, folks that are probably the senior CEOs of most companies didn't have to deal with it when they started. It's only showed up more recently. So we sort of take it for granted. And you can see this if you look at new companies, they don't have warehouses. There's very, very little space set aside. Even grocery stores do this a lot. Whole Foods, basically, if you ever go to the one in Kahala Mall, their warehouse is a little tiny section behind the store. They're Amazon. They depend entirely on just-in-time deliveries. So they don't have stuff stored. And that's the way they make money, because that means there's less rental space for space. They don't have to have storage. Don't have to worry about things breaking. It's fantastic from their standpoint. If I'm someone who makes, I don't know, bottled coffee or something like that, I'm not so thrilled about it. So something to think about. Okay, we segue to the next one. Okay, so this gets us back to what actually we were talking about last time. And this is this post-Fordist sort of growth model. When you're looking at the whole idea of production, and we'll get into just a couple minutes what the different parts of production cycles look like. It's really important to remember that growth model I mentioned last time, the idea that there's always supposed to be new and improved or better, is one hugely powerful model or sort of state of mind, I'd say, actually, that you see in the United States. You've got to actually show that, especially if you're someone in charge, like say the president or something like that, you've got to constantly show that in the time that I've been president, things are better than they were the year before. You're almost never going to get reelected in the United States, even in a crisis year like this, if basically you can say things are no worse than they were the year before. So if you notice Trump's advertising campaigns, things are actually better. And that's, to be honest, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. What matters is that's what Americans expect. It's part of our mental attitude. In the same way that you guys 5 years from now are supposed to be better than you are now. I have no idea what that's going to be for each of you. Maybe more educated, you're going to have more money, live in a nicer house, have a, you know, iPhone 25 or whatever will be 5 years from now. I don't know. You might not even know. But you're going to actually measure yourself. And you can see this when you talk to folks involved in counseling, which is one of our big programs here, is one of the main reasons that Americans rate themselves as failures is because their life isn't better than it was. And if you think about this, really sort of a terrifying concept, because who the hell defines better? And yet we basically judge our mental health in large part on this idea of our own sort of personalized version of growth models. And I should point out, this is one reason why a lot of other folks, most of the other planet doesn't have this. They have other mental health problems, but they don't have that as one of their primary sources of stress and other things. Okay, the other one is actually something the United States is very heavily involved in. This is one of the main purposes for the United Nations, is this idea of what we call development and quality of life. And it sort of ties in because if you notice, the thing with the growth models, it's a perceptual model. It's not based on measurables. It can be based on you know, how much money you make, but it has more to do with the fact that you see the amount of money you make as a measure of success. So at some point it comes back to perception and sort of personal or social or group attitudes. And so if you look at development, which is pretty much a 20th century concept, it really didn't exist in most ways prior to that. Prior to that, I think maybe what you had was colonialism, but in the 20th century, what you started to get is that gets replaced with the idea of a development model and a quality of life sort of model. And so what happens is you get the idea that there is where people are now, and there's where people should be. And the purpose of development, and this is one of the largest agencies in the United Nations. If you're a geographer, a huge proportion of geographers globally, especially in Europe and the United States, end up working for groups like the United Nations in development models. You can also work for other groups that do the same thing. Oxfam in Europe is another big example of this. So a development model is basically this. You measure what someone has. So we'll say that, I'm picking on Bridget, I'll pick on Bridget. You'll say that you measure her quality of life. Okay. Now, what's the weird thing about those two words? We'll skip of in the middle, but what's life mean? This is a real tricky Thursday afternoon, so if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, your brain's hurting. Question. So if we're talking about Bridget specifically, what's life mean? You guys are so tired. And he had Monday off this week. Shame, you guys. Whose life are we talking about? I know Bridget's staying out of this conversation. Bridget's not going to volunteer.
Is it my life?
Yeah, it's Bridget's life. Now, what's the weird thing about the word in front of that? So we could say quality of Bridget's life. What's the weird thing about the first word? Bridget can't answer this one because I picked on her already. What's the weird thing about this in American English?
It's kind of personal to her.
Okay, that's one big part. Is one, it's personal. What else though? If we try to compare, let's see, what I picked on it. If we try to compare Kayla's quality of Kayla's life to Bridget's quality of Bridget's life, what's the immediate problem we've got? And why would I stay like 100 feet away from that and never get involved in trying to even do it? Why is that a nightmare? And if you ever see that show up, run away from it as fast as your feet will take you.
You're measuring them from like a certain standard.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know either of you two. I know, I'm sure if I see you on campus, I might recognize you, but I don't know Kayla and Bridget. I have no idea what the quality of her life versus her life is. And to be honest, don't take this wrong, but I don't really care that much either, So I mean, quality, quality is a totally subjective term. You can't subject it to numbers. Now you guys see this. If you think of like a Likert scale, or oh well, I can like a Amazon or eBay or something like that, where you actually rate a retailer, you know, give them like 1 to 5 stars or whatever it is. That's a qualitative thing. But if you think about it, when you're going to buy something, at least if I do on Amazon, I check to make sure what the rating is of something before I even think of buying it. If it's got like 1 star, man, I'm out of there. Okay. Now it's entirely subjective what that 1 star means, or what 5 stars mean. And so if you're trying to compare the two of you as Chaminade students, what's your relative quality of life? Peyton's exactly right. I wish you a lot of luck on that. You could write like a 300-page essay and not say anything, because you can't compare the two things. You know, I'm pretty sure you're not the same person. You don't have the same last names. You don't particularly look like each other, as far as I can tell from your photos and stuff. So, you know, you're different. So why you'd have the idea that somehow you can compare this if they're the same would be a real stretch. You could compare that you're both at Chaminade. You're both stuck in this class. So yeah, I mean, you know, at some point there are some things you can compare, but I'm not, quality of life doesn't strike me as anything possibly you can do. Now, what makes it really bizarre about this is when you're looking at the idea of development, the goal of development, and this is literally a $1 trillion industry. The United States spends billions of dollars a week on development. Most other countries do, the European countries do. China is one of the big leaders right now in development money. When you give money out to a place or a group, what you're trying to do is improve their quality of life. Okay. So if Montserrat's in charge of a United Nations fund that's improving the quality of life for kids in the southern part of Somalia, and then life's pretty shitty there. Okay. And so all of a sudden it's been a year in and she's blown, you know, $500 million. Don't get carried away because I don't think you have that much money to spend, but we'll say hypothetically you do. So she's just gone through $500 million, okay? And we'll say that Aloha is her boss, okay? So Aloha now is going to ask her, okay, I want you to write a report on the $500 million that you spent for the kids in Somalia. Show me how you improve their quality of life. Why is that sort of like a creative writing exercise? Let's put it this way. Okay, let's say we actually give her the money. She's got $500 million to spend. No, you can't take it with you. You've got to spend it all in Somalia. So in that context, what would she do, in your view? What do you do to improve the quality of life of kids in a war-torn country? Just, I mean, off the top of your heads, don't think about this too deeply. You guys are rolling your eyes, which means you're thinking about it too much. So quit rolling your eyes and just come up with an answer.
Make like resources more available to them, like water.
Okay, water, food, maybe clothing. What else? That only blows about half a million. She's got 495 left.
Perhaps a school.
Okay, schools, education would be good. It's also good because she's got $500 million to blow. That's good because you can blow a bunch of money on schools. Okay, so that takes a nice chunk out of that amount of money she's got. What else can she spend it on? Remember, she's got to have all that money spent by next year.
Could roads count?
Yeah, infrastructure, hospitals. I mean, you know, the list goes on and on and on. Now, the year's now finished. She's blown the money, so she's a happy camper. She's done all these things. We'll say some really obnoxious person at the United Nations who actually is part of the oversight group actually ask her, okay, can you prove to me that you improve the quality of life of this kid? And they just point to one kid. And they want data. They want numbers. Where's she going to have a hard time? Now, obviously, what she's going to do is a before and after, right? Here's what the kid had before I showed up with $500 million. Here's what the kid's got after $500 million. So that part's going to be easy. Okay, we now got 3 schools. There's now a paved road in front. They've got sewage. They've got good water and food and stuff like that. But what's the problem with the quality word?
They might not think that
your quality is the same as their quality. They might think it's not quality enough.
Yeah. I mean, one of the huge issues in Somalia is you've got a huge number of very, very fundamentalist Muslim groups there. So in the view of her group that that kid is a part of, what she really wanted was better quality religious education. She was totally disinterested in schools or anything else. In fact, in her view, schools might actually be bad because they work against the religious education that she's supposed to get. So you might have stuff that, you know, to an American standard would be real obvious, improving quality of life. But Kayla's exactly right. You have no idea whether that applies to that person in that case in that place. They might have an entirely different set of agendas, which is the only thing that might be important to that particular lady is, you know, that I'm now, this is very true in Somalia, by the time I'm 17, I want to have 2 kids. You know, well, there's nothing that you did that helped that. So her $500 million just went put as far as the quality of life of that person from their standpoint is. From a data-driven standpoint, you can see you've got all these new things, but very frequently it has nothing to do with how people see their own quality of life. If you want to see this classically, there's a huge amount of audits, for example, of a huge amount of money that was spent in Iraq by the American development agencies to improve the quality of life in Iraq after the various wars there. And one of the things that they came up very frequently was the fact that Iraqis didn't see all the physical improvements as actually improving their quality of life. In fact, in some cases, they said they made their life worse. So you had the roads, you repaired the schools, you made hospitals, you made stuff available that, you know, in our view, would actually improve your quality of life. But that doesn't mean from the standpoint of the person that you're doing this for, that they have any agreement at all with how you're seeing it. And the problem is, of course, when you look at quality of life measures, they're defined by the people that are doing the development. In other words, the people that give the money are the ones that define what the quality of life things are going to be. Now, if Montserrat's, you know, classically out of the American or European context, that's going to be exactly the stuff you guys listed. It's going to be food, it's going to be water, it's going to be roads, it's going to be schools and hospitals. Why? Because those things are visible and they're measurable. You can see how many hospitals. Oh, we now got 120 hospital beds. We've got 6 doctors. We've got 4 schools. We got 25 teachers. Everyone's now got, you know, perfectly good, safe drinking water. And that's because the agency she works for is based on American and European money, and they want things that they can actually go back to their government and say, this is what we did with the money you gave us. It's got to be stuff that people can actually see and measure. And for Europeans and Americans, it has to be stuff that they think would be an improvement of someone's quality of life. But their places that they're giving this stuff to might not see that at all as being what they want. This is one of the weird problems in development, and both as an anthropologist and a geographer, I get involved in this all the time, is what is development? How do you improve someone's quality of life when you're doing it to them? You know, you're not putting them in charge of it, you're doing things for them. And you see this classically, we talk to folks on Guam and American Samoa. Quality of life, especially in Micronesia in general, quality of life is a surreal discussion because the United States has improved most of Micronesia since the 1950s up the yin yang. And in many cases, you can argue the end results have not been at all what one would sort of assume given the American logic behind the improvements that you made. Okay. So when you're looking at these, and this, you know, there's, again, trillions of dollars spent annually on development models and the idea of development, of improving something. And the measure is invariably quality of life. And if you ever get involved in this, this is the reason for the East-West Center over UH, for example, which I worked for a while. This gets to be something you get nightmares in the middle of the night about. You know, how do I write up how a quality of life was improved, or when a project starts, what am I going to do to improve the quality of life of people, for example, in American Samoa? You know, what are you going to do? Whose measures to use? You know, and why is that measure better than someone else's measure? And for example, if you're talking about from the American Samoan standpoint, what they want to see in terms of quality of life improvements might not be what American government, this is very true with the American government, it's not what the American government wants to pay for. The American government wants visible stuff. Samoans probably want something that's not as visible, but it's more important to them. Well, the American government's going to tell them, We're not going to pay for that. Because that doesn't fit our view of quality of life, and we're the ones with a debit card. You're not. This has become an enormous issue. If you look at current political discussions, this has become an absolutely huge issue in the last 2 years with China. China is dropping, I believe, almost $1 trillion in development in Africa, in the African continent. And one of the huge complaints in places like Kenya and other places where they've literally got hundreds of millions of dollars coming in is that it's actually making the quality of life worse for large amounts of the population. At the same time, from the Chinese standpoint, what they're doing makes perfect sense to improve quality of life. So two entirely different discussions or two entirely different evaluations of exactly the same thing in exactly the same place and dealing with exactly the same stuff. And you have to remember this becomes really critical, because if you guys do, as you very likely are, to go to other places in the world, you're going to define that depending on where you come from. Your passport, for example, and where you identify yourself from, you're going to get judged in part upon what your country's done or hasn't done in terms of the locals' view of their quality of life. Have you made it better? Have you made it worse? Now, they're not interested in you as an individual. But for example, this is one of the reasons why traveling with an American passport can be sort of iffy. If I had my choice, I'd travel with a Canadian passport, because no one has a particular attitude about Canadians one way or the other, which is really sort of nice. But yeah, if you're American and you travel in a lot of the world, they just look at you and it's sort of like, well, you guys did this, and you guys screwed up that, and you guys gave us all this money for that, and we didn't need these schools, and da da da. They're sort of like, well, dude, I didn't do it. It's just I'm a taxpayer. They don't care. They see this whole package as a thing, because what they see is when you bring that stuff in, you're trying to make them like you. Your idea of the quality of life, since you're the one paying the bills, is what you're expecting them to want. So they're making you, they see you as trying to make them into like surrogate Americans. And this is the big issue, the pushback with the Chinese, is folks in a lot of Africa are all pissed off because they see the Chinese wanting to turn the folks in East Africa into being surrogate Chinese by virtue of saying what they're going to spend the money on. It's one of those no-win scenarios. But again, this is one of the huge aspects in global systems in terms of idea of development. They're having the World Bank meetings right now that discuss, that's what they discuss, is that that's a development agency. They discuss globally where the money on planet Earth is going to be spent to make things better and improve people's quality of life. Good luck on that. Now to something that's a lot simpler. Sectors. This is a really simple set of concepts, but it's like production and labor. It's a real simple set of concepts, but on the other hand, they're tremendously powerful when you're trying to figure out where societies have been, where societies are, and where they're going to be. And then our stepchild that we're going to look at would be China. So there's basically until 50 years ago, there were only actually four levels. There's now a fifth that's been introduced, and that's largely due to the internet. So the first of these would be the primary sector. The primary sector right now, a really good example would be Australia. Australia is one of the world's major producers of iron ore, copper, all sorts of metals. They're one of the world's major producers of, Chinese just put a tariff on this morning, I forgot what it was. I'm going to say soybeans, but I'm not sure I got it right. I think it's soy. So primary sector means basically that you're a country or a region or something that produces some sort of raw material that then is consumed. So you could be a farmer growing crops, you could be a miner digging holes in the ground and taking out ore. That would be a primary sector economy. A huge part of what Australia does to make money, and Australia is very wealthy, is because they basically dig up the land and they farm the land and they run sheep on the land and then they sell that stuff somewhere. Okay. So being a farmer, being a sheep herder, being a miner, all those would be primary sector activities. Okay. Now, this is something we pretty much do not do here in Hawaii, with the exception of maybe coffee, which is a Gucci thing. We don't really do any primary sector here anymore. Okay. So we don't produce anything that's sold anywhere else. Okay. But that'd be primary sector. Secondary sector is where you turn that into something. Okay. So, okay, I've got this here. So my little pen here. Okay. Primary sector would be what, if you're looking at a pen? I'll give you a hint. It's actually not the pen itself.
The plastic.
Yeah, it's where the plastics came from. There's rubber here. We'll assume, I'm sure it's not, but we'll assume this is actually natural rubber. This would probably come from Malaysia, from rubber trees. You've got chrome on here. That's chromium. That comes probably from Russia, Siberia, I would guess. Maybe New Caledonia. You've got the ink inside. God knows what the hell the ink's made out of. So you've got all these different things, and you're exactly right. The primary sector would be the raw materials that make up a pen. Okay. Now the secondary sector would be, whose is this? I have no idea whose company this is. We'll say it's Bic. We'll say that this is a Bic pen. Secondary sector would be the factory. So in the secondary sector, what you take is the raw materials. So you take the chrome ore that's coming from Russia. You take the rubber coming from trees in Malaysia. You take the plastics coming from Saudi Arabia, and you put it through all sorts of machinery, and again, our factories and stuff like that. But ding out the other end with some sort of noise like that, here comes a pen. Okay. So the secondary sector is the production sector. That's where you convert the stuff from the raw form to the final form of a pen I'm going to make a mess with. Okay. So that part's pretty straightforward. Now, China isn't really a primary sector. It is with food. But China, as of the 1980s, 1990s, and this probably was made in a Chinese factory, became the world's leader for secondary sector, to the extent that roughly, I think it was 65, 70% of the stuff made on planet Earth about 5 years ago or 10 years ago was made somewhere in a factory in China. So the entire Chinese economy is based on what we call the secondary sector. Now, what's vulnerable about a factory? What does this factory need to make pens? Again, this is a Thursday afternoon question. I don't want to challenge you guys intellectually.
Workers.
Even before you get there,
The plastic?
yeah, you need the primary sector. If you don't got the chrome, you don't got the plastics, you don't got the rubber, you're going to make no pens. Okay, so the primary sector drives the secondary sector, and the secondary sector tells the primary sector, we need you to dig up more iron ore, we need more chrome, we need more whatever it is, and then that's what's turned into these objects. Okay, so there's an interrelationship between the two. Okay. If the secondary sector suddenly doesn't need iron ore anymore, then what's going to happen to the mines in Australia? They're shut down. Why would you going to dig up something if you can't sell it? Find better ways to spend your day than digging holes in the ground and just leaving them there. So secondary sector is the production. Now, we don't do any of that either. Hawaii has no primary sector and Hawaii has no secondary sector. We don't make anything here. Even like this shirt, I have no idea. This is an ancient shirt, but I have no idea where it's from, but I can guarantee it probably was very likely and very rare it would actually be sewn in Hawaii. Okay. Probably Saipan, I would guess, maybe. So in that situation, what you have is you have the third tier. So if you go from the raw materials to the manufacturing part to the third part is oftentimes what we would call sales and service. So if I go and I'm buying this from, I don't know, from Longs. Okay. Longs would be a good example of a tertiary sector business. Now, Hawaii is an entirely tertiary sector economy. We don't make anything here. We don't dig up anything here. What we do is we provide services. So you go to a Longs to buy stuff. And you know, if Emily's working at Walmart, then she helps you, you know, go through a cash register operation, or if she's, you know, she says hi when you come in the store, whatever the hell she does at Walmart. So, you know, all that type of stuff, that's all tertiary sector. This is oftentimes called the service sector. Now, as you can well see in October 2020 with the economy the way it is, what's the danger of a service sector only economy? I'll give you a perfect example. Yesterday, DFS, which is duty-free shoppers, laid off almost their entire workforce. I was still shocked that they actually still had a workforce. They have big stores in Waikiki, but they also, of course, have big stores in the airports. Anyone know what duty-free shoppers is? If you're going to buy there, how do you get into the shop? What do you have to show them?
Membership?
Nope. Good guess, but not quite. Don't need to be a member, but you need to have something with you. I'll give you a hint. Does anyone know what duty free means? It means you're not paying American taxes for it. So if I'm from here and I can go into a duty free shop at the airport, what do I have to show them at the shop? I'll give you a hint. It's something you pick up at an airport. I have to show that I'm going on an airplane out of the United States.
Passport.
Yeah, I have to show them my passport, but I usually have to also show them a ticket. Otherwise, they'll just think, well, you know, you guys just are like, you guys are bogus or something like that. Okay, sorry, I didn't see Kayla's suggestion here. Yeah, play areas, yeah, that might work. So, no idea what that's about. So anyway, so in that context, yeah, so that's duty free. Duty free requires people coming into an airport that are going to somewhere else on the planet or leaving Hawaii to go somewhere else like Japan or somewhere. You can't use duty free if you're going to go to LA. Much as you might think that Vegas is a different part of the planet, it's not. It's technically part of the United States, so you can't go to duty free, you know, and buy stuff to take to Vegas with you. You'd have to be going to somewhere else outside of the U.S. So that's a good example of a service economy in Hawaii. What's the problem that duty free has in October 15th, 2020? Why did they lay everyone off? What isn't at the airport anymore?
Tourists.
Yeah, there's no one flying in and out of Hawaii going anywhere else on the planet. And that's why they shut down the huge store in Waikiki, which was, I think, 3 or 4 stories high. I forget, it's been years since I've been in there. It's this huge store right on Kalakaua. Because guess what? There's no one there from some other part of the planet. You can't, if you guys want to fly to Japan, you cannot. The Japanese are not allowing foreigners, especially Americans, into Japan. It is closed to us. Which also means if you're Japanese, you cannot fly here because they're not going to let you back in either. So you don't have foreign tourists at the airport. So therefore, a store that specializes in foreign tourists has no reason for their existence because they don't make anything. They don't produce an object, and they're not primary sector. They're tertiary sector. So a service sector economy requires that people have some set of needs that you can fulfill by virtue of the need to acquire, but not, you're not making pens, you're selling pens. A radically different type of thing. Now, some economies have done very well in this, and in fact, Japan's sort of an interesting example. Japan until the 1980s was one of the world's secondary sector economies. Japanese produced a ton of stuff. Now, there's almost no secondary sector left in Japan. Japan's almost entirely tertiary sector. So if you're Sony, for example, which is a large Japanese electronics company, everything that you make is actually made in Malaysia. They're a Japanese company, but they don't make anything in Japan anymore. Because again, go back to our labor thing. Labor's a lot cheaper in Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you go and you look at Sony stuff in Japan, that's sold in electronic stores like you'd find in Akihabara or something like that. And that's a tertiary sector. So a tertiary sector would include things like restaurants. It's the whole world that you guys live in because we're a tertiary economy here in Hawaii. When you walk down Wailea Avenue, that's a tertiary economy. Even things like, for example, car repair shops or something like that, tertiary economy. Nail salons, tertiary economy. Okay. So in a tertiary system, you have all sorts of other needs. One is you have to have a primary, secondary sector that you can tap because if you're going to sell something, you better have something to sell. Secondly is the population has to have the resources to be able to spend in a tertiary sector. It doesn't do any good to have a restaurant if no one has any money to buy food from the restaurant. So a tertiary sector economy is very, very fragile because you can't transfer it to somewhere else. Now, if you think about it, if you're a company that makes pens and all of a sudden people in the United States stop buying pens, as long as you can find somewhere else in the world where people still want to buy pens, you can keep your factories running. And if you're a place that digs up iron ore, all you got to do is find some other use for iron ore. which ironically now you can use in batteries, since that's the new LiPo batteries use iron. So fine, okay, I don't make iron for cars anymore, but now I make iron for batteries. So I still got a reason to dig the stuff up out of the ground. So a tertiary sector is a very fragile economy. And the interesting thing is what's happened in China is, unlike Japan, where they basically planned for this, the Chinese decided back in the 1980s that a secondary sector economy wasn't where they wanted to be in 20 or 40 years. I'm not sure why they made the choice. I've never asked them, and they wouldn't tell me anyways. But they decided that they were going to move, and one of the things they shifted to is more of a tertiary sector. So most Japanese work in places that are tertiary. The work that I do outside of here deals with the Japanese tourism industry, specifically NTA, Nippon Travel Agency, is one of the companies we work with. And that's a tertiary economy. If you're a travel agent, if you run tours, if you're a tour guide or something like that, that's a tertiary sector economy. And that's part of that part of the world. And not surprisingly, those guys are in a world of hurt right now in Japan, not surprisingly when you think about it. So tertiary economy is a very different type of proposition. Now, what happened in China's case is they thought they were going to stay here. China really, really wants, even in 2020, China wants to be where everything is made on planet Earth, because they realize that's actually a pretty safe place to be, because people's desire to want things is constantly increasing. So if you're the place that makes it, your only problem is having enough hours in the week to make the stuff. But what's happened is, for a bunch of reasons, basically labor cost, most of that is leaving China. Now China suddenly finds themselves in this sector. They suddenly find themselves in a service sector, but they had never been brought up for that, and they hadn't set up their economy for that. So they're not really sure what they're doing, and they also don't know exactly how this is going to play out. Because this is a much more uncertain sector. You've got to be much more careful how you run an economy when it's service driven than when it's basically production driven. And you can see the fallout that happens when something surprisingly happens like COVID and how it hits us, where just basically everything just disappears. Okay. Now, the fourth of these, and this is the trickiest, is what the United States mainland is. The United States mainland, in many ways, and this is why you guys are a university in one way, shape, or form, I would assume, is what we call a quaternary system. Okay. So if any of you are, for example, involved in the medical field, if you're going to go into the hospital work in some way, shape, as a nurse, doctor, whatever, a nurse would be tertiary. Okay. A hospital would, to a certain extent, be tertiary. It provides services. Okay. Hospitals don't produce anything. They use stuff. They're tertiary. If Emily is actually a doctor and she's in charge of a unit at a hospital, she's what we call quaternary sector, or the fourth tier. Okay. And what that means is she spends a lot of her time making decisions. So she's in charge of a unit. She figures out where the doctors are going to work, maybe what surgeries are going to undertake this week or whatever, stuff like that. She's a decision maker. You guys could call her a manager. Okay, that's quaternary. Okay. So if you think about the best example, this would be the banking sector. If let's say, I already picked on you guys. Who haven't picked on yet? Who's lurking down here? Okay, if Amy, for example, is head of Bank of Hawaii. Okay, congratulations, by the way. That's part of a quaternary economy. She's not actually producing anything. She's got branches where people, help out customers and stuff like that. But the main thing they do is they manage and manipulate money and resources in Hawaii. Okay, back in the day, because they were a Hawaii bank. So quaternary is control of these three above them. So the management of CVS would be quaternary. A particular store would be tertiary. Management, Broken Hill Mines, which is the huge Australian mining company. The company is quaternary in the sense of the guys that run it. What they do is they dig holes in the ground. That's a primary sector activity. So quaternary means when your entire economy becomes involved with basically control and manipulation. A really good example of this has been around for about 100 years would be Switzerland. The Swiss don't really produce a hell of a lot. They don't really even have a large tertiary sector. What they do is they're basically the center for global banking and finance. So a huge proportion of the population in Switzerland, if we were a Swiss university, a lot of you folks would be getting your degrees in finances. Why? For a very simple reason, because that's where all the jobs are. And you'd be running the finances for pretty much every place in Europe and even other places. And that's what a quaternary economy is. A quaternary economy is when you control decision-making and resource movement, either locally or regionally. Now, what happens about 30, 40 years ago is the internet suddenly grows up. And in that situation, we already sort of mentioned this in some other context that I've forgotten about, is that all of a sudden this grows up. So who was it? Oh, Amy was Bank of Hawaii. Okay. So all of a sudden it's now, I don't know, 1995, I'm just making this up. So assume 1995, and Bank of Hawaii gets partially bought out by a huge Euro-Canadian consortium, which I think is what it was. Now, all of a sudden, Bank of Hawaii, on one hand, it's still a Hawaii bank, but it's actually part of a huge global consortium of banks that are run so Amy's boss is now Emily and someone else, and they're actually running this company from somewhere on planet Earth. And rather than making decisions about what's going on in Hawaii, she's now making decisions on how they're going to do banking globally. So she's worried about what's going to happen in Hong Kong, what's happening in Singapore, what's happening in Paris, what's happening in London, what's happening in Cairo, Egypt, and what's happening in Honolulu. And she's making decisions on that level. So this is what you might call global decision making versus this, which was pretty much local or regional. If you want a good example, this would be Silicon Valley. Google and Facebook, and I think those other companies we started talking about before, those are actually quinary sector economies or quinary sector companies. If you're Google, you don't think about things in terms of the American world. You think about things in terms of the global world, because Google is a global company. And that's how you have to think, and that's how you have to work if you work there. So that's a quinary thing. So if you're coming up with a marketing strategy at Google, you're coming up with a global marketing strategy, not a California strategy or a West Coast strategy or even an American strategy. That's something that required the internet, where you could actually have global decision making in real time. And you guys could see this, if we were part of a company like the guys I work with in Japan, we could be having a Zoom session talking about how we're going to do something. If we're talking to one of the clients, like say Chase Manhattan, they're talking about what they want to do in a global context. And so, Kayla and Peyton and Bridget are all from, the Japanese part of the operation. Madison and I are part of the, mainland or US part of the operation. And Emily is Chase Manhattan. And so she's looking at it in terms of the global implications, and she's making decisions that impact everything in a global operation. Don't get carried away because this is all hypothetical, but feel free to fantasize if you're into it. So that's quinary. That couldn't have existed 50 years ago. You couldn't do that with a set of telephones. You needed to be able to share data, to share real-time information. She can basically say, okay, Bordner, what are the actual numbers? I need to see what are the current numbers as of this morning. And she wants to see from Kayla, what are the current numbers in Japan as of right now? And you can give her that stuff, and boom, or else you get fired. Boom, and she's got all that. She can make a decision based on what's actually happening at 1:55 in the afternoon Honolulu time. Okay. So that's something that's brand new. That's never has existed before. Now, why does that work against being president of the United States? Let me segue down here, see who I haven't picked on yet. I'm sure I left someone out. Xavier. Okay, Xavier is now president of the United States. Congratulations, by the way. Or commissioner reasons, I'm not sure what you want to have on that. How doesn't that fit into this quinary thing? I mean, at some point, Xavier could do a little stuff, declare war, for example, on China or something like that. But what's the problem that's going to happen? What isn't there access to that the quinary sector has access to?
The world.
Yeah, the world. Xavier's decisions are going to impact the United States. They might have ancillary impacts somewhere else, but Xavier can't tell the French, do this. They're going to look at him like, what? Just because it's Thursday, why should I listen to you? Okay. If on the other hand, if you're Google and you tell the Google operation in Europe to do something, it's going to get done because it's part of a quinary sector system. Now, one of the really sort of surreal aspects of stuff that you guys don't think about, and there's no reason you would unless you want to give yourself a nightmare, is that anything you do financially is now global. Banking systems are not national. Bank of America is not a national bank. Bank of England isn't a national bank. HSBC, who are some relatives of mine work for, a Hong Kong, Shanghai bank. That's now actually based in London, but it's now actually based in the Bahamas. I have no idea what that's about. I'm sure it's a tax evasion of some sort, but they're a global operation. I think you can get a credit card from HSBC in 72 countries. And what that means is at some point, if the United States says we don't like you, HSBC is going to look at them like, blow it out your ear. Why do we care? They're larger than a country. So the whole issue that we're going to get into politics, this idea of sovereignty, which you control things within your borders. You guys are the first generation that's grown up in a world where there's no such thing as border control. People try to institute it. The discussions we have, about things like, controlling internet access at the national level, like the Chinese do, is an attempt at the quaternary level to put controls on this at the quinary level, but it doesn't work. The Chinese use IPNs and then see the same stuff you guys see. So the government tries to make controls and everyone goes, and they just blow it off. These are the 5 sectors of the global economy. And what's really creepy about this, when you think about it, is that last one has only been around for 20 something years, which means we do not know how important it is. We do not know how you control it. We do not know much of anything about it. The bugger is entirely new, and yet it is global. And this is one of the weird sort of ancillary side effects of the internet, is the reality that we not only live in a global world, you can see that with your phone. Think of your Instagram or Snapchat or, TikTok account or something like that. You've got people that can watch it from almost anywhere on planet Earth. And you can send money to anywhere on planet Earth through PayPal or whatever else services you use. But it also means you don't know what's happening anywhere on planet Earth, and you don't know what's going to impact you from somewhere else on planet Earth. And that didn't exist in your parents' generation. In your parents' generation, it was national. There were national borders, there were national boundaries. Banks and financial services were national. The British had a different banking service than the French. The Americans had a different banking service than Canada or Mexico. Not now. It's a global thing, which means if something in the United States doesn't like something, it doesn't necessarily mean if that company has to pay any attention to them. So the input that people have in quinary systems is actually really minor. And this is something that came up occasionally because there was some time when the Congress was going after Zuckerberg at Facebook. It was telling him he had to do something. He actually turned on it. You can find this little video clip in YouTube somewhere. And he actually turned on him and said, no, I don't. He just said, we just moved the operations out of the United States. And roughly 55% of the world's population uses Facebook. So he doesn't need the United States. If the Americans said you have to control this stuff and you can't allow this stuff on Facebook, he can go, okay, I'll think about it. But they can't tell him you have to. The minute they say have to, he's going to go, no, I don't have to do squat. You're not in a position of control over me. And this is the sort of surreal part of the quinary sector. We've never had a global system where you had a set of, especially financial sector, but also things like Facebook, internet-based systems, which are not subject to national control, which means at some point they're not really subject to law. This has become a huge fear for the financial sectors, is the financial sector is not subject to national law, which means if Payton's the U.S. Attorney General, he decides he wants to basically investigate, he wants to audit HSBC, he wants to investigate their accounts. All they have to show him is the accounts in the United States. If he says, I need to actually see what you guys are doing globally, let's just tell him no. So at some point, there is no control over what folks in the banking investment industry do. They're not subject to law. They're higher up than that, which is something we're starting to see with a lot of the internet companies, is when they're told to do something, they basically say no. And if you notice, what happens is it's not like they changed their attitude. Facebook didn't do anything any different, pretty much. They just sort of walked away from the congressional hearings. He said, oh, I'll take that into account. And then I'm sure he went back, had a cup of Starbucks or something like that, and went back and sort of laughed with his friends, and then went back to do whatever the hell they were going to do. Congress can't do anything to Facebook any more than they can do anything to Google. And that's a really different situation, because at that point, who controls this? It's not necessarily maybe they have to be controlled, but if suddenly there's a general consensus that something's not going right, how do you make that behavior change? And That's a new world. That's the world that you guys are going to live in, because guess what? You're the ones that are becoming adults in it. So it's to make you all cheered on a Thursday afternoon, in case you're prone to paranoia. It's a good way to do it. So these 5 sectors are really critical. In a COVID-based world, the tertiary sector takes it on the chin first, would be my assessment. I'm just saying this off the top of my head. I would think very quickly after that would be the secondary sector. Why? Good example would be Macy's. If Macy's isn't open, so Macy's isn't selling any stuff, what's the problem you're going to have if you're the folks that make clothes for Macy's? They ain't buying any of your clothes, because guess what? They ain't open. They can't sell anything, so why would they pay for you to make clothes for them? So all of a sudden then what's going to happen is the secondary sector is going to get hit second. So it's like a domino effect. And eventually what's going to happen is the guys growing cotton in some places like India are going to find that they don't need to pick that cotton, because guess what? There's no one that's using the cloth to make clothes out of, because Macy's can't sell them. So when you look at this whole COVID thing, this is why they're pointing out that it's going to take a long time for it to recover economically, because different countries in different parts of the world and different economic sectors, the impacts occurred at different points in time and has occurred in different ways. So it's sort of like a train starting up again. It's going to have to go, pieces are going to have to start pulling, and other pieces pull other pieces, and then it sort of gets back to normal. But it's not going to be like you suddenly turn on and pump, everything like shows up again. So this one, actually, ironically, in a COVID world, the model of these sectors is a really useful way to look at how this is impacting different societies in different places in different ways. Okay, since that was good fun for a Thursday afternoon. Okay, any questions about that stuff? Like I think I mentioned last time, an easy way to think about this, you're looking at this stuff, and especially because there's going to be a huge amount of discussion about tourists coming back, since I think it opened up today, supposedly, hypothetically. Yeah, okay. So in that situation, it'd be really interesting to look at what you're going to see in the news reports in the next week or so, in terms of how many businesses were, quote, saved, unquote, by the tourists showing back up again. As a geographer, I'd say my suspicion is somewhere between 0 and not very many, but you know, it's just my opinion as a geographer. But nonetheless, if you look at this from a production standpoint, especially tertiary sector, a lot of this makes a lot more sense in terms of the sequence of events and the time that it takes for things to, you know, turn back to, quote, normal, unquote, whatever that means. Okay. So we're all sort of good for the day? Well, relatively speaking. Well done for class for the day. Let's put it that way.